right, welcome back. Thank you for coming back for yet another episode. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guests introduce themselves. So, and not in order of importance, just top to bottom, because, you know, I can handle the clockwork method. Killian, can you introduce yourself to people who haven't listened to your episode yet?
Sure thing. Hello, my name is Killian Wolf, and I am an author and archaeologist. I write YA and new adult fantasy, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, fairy tale retellings.
Okay.
And I'm Malachi Fenn. I am an archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and I'm also a scientific illustrator. And I just have a big personal interest in sci-fi, and it's part of why I became an archaeologist. So I'm very excited to be here today, and thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're all nerds of history. So what was the first time where you said, you know what, these dead people are kind of cool? So I'll give it, like, I've always found people fascinating, alive or dead. So I one of my majors before I had to narrow it down was sociology as well. So sociology, for those who don't know, it's like the study of history, only the people are still alive. And when they're alive, they can argue with you. When they're dead, not so much. So for me, it was simple. I like history too. And it was, I like that they didn't argue with me. So when I got my master's and my bachelor's, it was history. Because like I said, everyone that could disagree with me is gone. So what about you guys?
I was always interested in it, but didn't know it was a real job until I was already in college.
Okay.
I was interested in anthropology because I found out that Kurt Vonnegut studied anthropology, and I thought it might be like, a smart move, do something fun in undergrad and then do something more responsible later on. But once I got to my undergrad, New College of Florida, one of the older students told me you could be an archaeologist just with a BA and going to field school, and my goose was cooked.
So did you specialize in any certain area? Like any like era of time, culture, or anything like that?
For my undergrad, I did pre-colonial Maya archaeology.
Okay.
Yeah. Mostly, or my thesis was about a site in Belize, Cajalpech, and a cache of ceramic figurines they had there.
Okay, what about you, Killian?
I was interested in archaeology since I was a kid. Before that, it was paleontology. Until I got older, and I was very interested in the human psyche and helping other humans. So I first went into psychology, actually. And eventually I kind of I was interested in studying why people do the things they do instead of the individuals. So I broke away from individual and I went into cultural anthropology and sociology. And speaking to my advisors in university before getting my bachelor's, they kind of just asked me, like, what do you want to do? And I was very interested in archaeology, but a lot like Malachi, I wasn't really aware that it could be an actual career that you can actually do full time. And then from there, I went to field school in Spain, in Menorca, and I was working on an ancient Roman basilica.
Cool.
Yeah. And then, surprisingly, it was not very difficult to get hired after that because we were working in Miami and there was a site going on in downtown. So that's where we both met.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I like that. So the internships I did, so I studied ancient and medieval, which is a very huge swath of time for those who haven't looked at a calendar, as an undergrad. And I realized that if I was going to do those areas to pick any of that for a concentration, I'd have to learn a foreign language a lot better than I spoke because I was struggling with German in college. And my advisor was like, well, when you go to your master's degree, why don't you pick something in America because you speak English okay? And I'm like, oh, those colonials were pretty okay, because I was always been interested in the Civil War. But that's an area of American history that's so played out. Everybody and their brother has argued over every individual topic about it 100 ways from Sunday. But like, there's only been a recent resurgence in the colonial era. So that's what I got my master's degree in, is colonial American history. And so I did my internship at Valley Forge, the historic encampment where the American Army camped, which was kind of cool. I was on a dig site, so I was just a straight historian. I wasn't an actual archaeologist, but there was a dig site on site. And for the most part, interns didn't get to do anything but like, here, hold the flashlight kind of thing. They didn't want you to touch anything. But 15 meters north-ish of where they were doing the dig, across the line to private property, and the homeowner was like, hey, you can play on my land. I don't care. You can't make it any worse. And if you find something, I get a tax write-off, right? Because now his land is historic. That area of Pennsylvania is very like big on protecting history. So we went digging, and sure enough, we found some cool stuff. So for like however long they air the artifacts we found, it'll have my name on it forever at the Valley Forge Museum, which is kind of cool.
That's very cool.
But you know, anybody who's worked in museums doesn't, like, if you haven't, but they rotate those exhibits all the time. So, you know, it was there for like 2 or 3 years. It probably will show up in 100 years again. By then, I won't care. So, did you guys ever find anything when you were in the field that was, you know, neat enough that it made it to a museum?
You want to start?
Do you need time to think? So what I found was actually Hessian equipment, the metal that survived from the Hessian troops. Apparently, more of them than we knew crossed over and fought for the Americans. The promise of free land will do that for you.
Oh yeah.
I will say, to preface everything I'm about to say, that the difference between what archaeologists think is important and what museum workers think is museum quality can be very different.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fair point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it can be very hard to say what's going to end up in a museum or not. I know that everything that we've dug up is currently housed in a repository, but to my knowledge, the site report for the site that we worked on 10 years ago, I believe, has not been completed. Hopefully I'm wrong. I haven't seen it.
Listen. When I did my internship at the Deering Estate, I was uncovering boxes from 1987 from the you-know-who archaeologist. So rest assured that what we have uncovered...
So that's actually something that historians and archaeologists both battle, is the amount of times we've made discoveries that we just forgot about because they got stuck in a warehouse somewhere. So part of what I did at Valley Forge as an intern was catalog those boxes and boxes of stuff from all the previous digs. Like, oh, I didn't know we discovered one of those here. And I'm like, it's been in your warehouse for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
So it's always amazing. I wonder how much of that changes as technology with computers and the searchability and stuff. I wonder if that's gotten any better.
No, there's
no.
It's easier to search within databases and collections now, but the collections crisis has been ongoing since the 1930s.
They have to be digitized, first of all, and because there's just so much, you know, so much of it, you know, that it's really hard.
So what I spent the summer mostly taking inventorying the weapons in the arms locker, which is an interesting prospect because if anything ever happens, the halon gas drops down and you've got like 2 or 3 minutes to exit. And so I asked him what happens if I didn't make it out the door quick enough. And I remember the park ranger was like, well, we can get new interns. You're free. So we spent the time.
God. And interestingly, that is part of the internship project that I did when I was doing my first internship at a museum, is I also had to catalog all the weapons and curate a little weapons exhibit.
Right.
That is cool.
And I'll add this because it's interesting. Said weapons I was supposed to be working on iconography on a bunch of Weeden Island vessels, which is a particular pottery in Florida. What ended up happening the night before my internship started was that someone in a pickup came and dumped a huge cardboard box of jumbled swords and knives at the back steps of the museum. And I got there in the morning and they put this huge box in front of me and said, "This is your internship now instead." I actually traced a few sources of the swords, and eventually they got into a little like mini exhibit, which was really fun to do.
That's good.
That is cool. I will say that actually working with the physical, tangible effects of history make you rethink things. Like everyone assumes that people in history were shorter until you realize that no, they were just more in like frugal. So if the pants still fit when they left the army, they just wore them until they wore out. So mostly what survives is the stuff for people that were so oddly sized that nobody else would wear them. Not so much that so the shorter people, like the short kings, their equipment or their pants got stuck in a box somewhere. And then the other one that I heard a lot, because I gave the tour for the farmhouse where George Washington and Martha Washington spent that winter. And everyone assumed that they were so much shorter because the rooms had that optical illusion. And then you realize, man, the ceilings were a lot taller. And then if you factor in like they would sleep in the incline because they thought that was healthier, well, the beds don't need to be as long anymore. So it wasn't that everyone was shorter. It was just, we try to compare everybody to ourselves, which I think works to a point, and that'll bring our first discussion. But I think there's room to accept that they exist still within their own culture of the time, and people forget that. So do you buy because this was the first day my master's degree was this argument between all of us was, are people fundamentally people, or are we different now than we were, say, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago? There is no wrong answer because nobody knows.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we have seen, different catalogs or scriptures of people complaining about things that today people complain about, like, and I can't tell you where this came from, or it was just so long ago that I read it, but they were like hieroglyphs of fathers, complaining that kids today, kids today.
Our least favorite Mesopotamian copper merchant, who's now risen to infamy.
They actually recently unearthed some parchment documents, or I don't know if they just found them or they just started opening them and going through them. And in the margins of this essentially text book for kids teaching the young scribes how to read, they're like doodling and making insults about their teacher. So in some respects, that hasn't changed.
Graffiti, we find
the graffiti
all the time.
Yes, we see of historic graffiti.
Yeah.
So I studied military history in my undergrad because I went to a military school. And so one of the things that surprised me is how some things never change. So like on a lot of Roman sites, the same, phallic jokes and phallic art, I'm trying to keep it family friendly, that appear there that wouldn't look too off from what I saw in porta potties in Iraq circa 2005.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, in some respects, our crude humor hasn't changed. So I think there's some of that as well.
You'd be hard pressed to find a perfectly universal human nature, but there is a lot of stuff that rhymes all across time and geography,
Yeah.
Okay. So when we came up with the topic for this fireside chat, dear listener, it actually was Miss Killian's episode when we were doing the pre-show and we were just talking. And I invite all of our guests because fireside chats are fun, and I can't think of all the ideas myself. So if they have ideas for topics, I'm game to host it. And so she mentioned that it could be fun to do maybe something with the what do they call it? Con language? No. What's that called? Yeah, what does that stand for? Constructed languages. Right. She thought that one could be fun, and that's still in the works. Or like writing believable histories for fictional worlds. And that got me thinking is, I've read a lot of fantasy specifically or alien cultures where they try to, dive into the history and lore of that culture world peoples. And it sometimes fell flat, and I never thought to analyze why. So what do you think is the number one marker that lets you think something is more realistic than not when they write about these fictional histories in speculative fiction?
For one, or if you want to.
I was saying that's a great question.
We'll talk first. So I think that it really depends on how the writer is going to start off with their plot or their outline. If they're going to start character first, or if they're going to start world building first. I personally feel like it needs to really correspond together, because whatever your world building is, it needs to basically play a part in how it's going to directly affect the character. And if your character is part of that culture, that society, then that society has grown because of its environmental influences. But if your character is coming from, for instance, in my Chronicles of Terrorland world, where they're coming from Earth and they're being thrown into this whole other dimension, then still you're going to be observing how the natives deal with their environment. And now you have your character from Earth dealing with a whole brand new environment. So you're looking at it from like an outsider perspective, kind of like an anthropologist.
In anthropology words, that's called the Edic perspective.
Okay.
Yes.
So
also answer the question.
Go ahead.
Is that I agree with Killian. It's how your characters interface with the world that you've built. Because the sci-fi that I've read most recently are Manhunt and Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. And the characters interact with the world around them in ways that are really sensory and really visceral. Definitely like lots of questions that anthropologists and archaeologists ask about like what life is like and what other group of people's experiences of life are like. And when they're really thought out in detail in terms of the human experience, that is the most exciting part of sci-fi to me, speculative fiction.
So for me, I think of it in terms, so I'll give you as an example. One of the big shows back in the day, and I'm old enough, I remember when the History Channel actually showed history stuff and not like ice road truckers and aliens. But they used to do, I also remember music on MTV. They used to do this show where they would take these cultures that never encountered each other and who would win, the Spartans or the pirates or the whatever. It was a fun show. They sort of took what we knew of their equipment, they sort of measured it mathematically to see, and then they ran their scenarios, assuming you trust their computer model. It was fascinating. But one of the things that they talked about that struck me as true because it fit with what I studied when I studied history is that nothing happens in a vacuum. So when you've got assault and defense, attack and defense equipment, one is a response to the other. So there's that constant yin yang back and forth, the yo-yoing of technology. I invent a sharper spear, you invent a thicker shield. You invent the thicker shield, so I need a sword that can reach under it, or whatever. Like the world evolves in response to itself, in response to it. And so when you see cultures where they write where one culture is just so vastly superior on a planet, that just doesn't fit without you giving me a good reason. For instance, when you've got two apex predators, for instance, alien creatures existing on a world where one of them was dominant and you can't explain how that happened in a way that makes sense. That's one of the things that breaks it for me, is the idea of like the world doesn't appear to follow like basic evolutionary ideas as we understand them. So I tend to think in terms of the equipment because, I'm a military historian by training. And so for me, that's the big one, is when the equipment, the arms race, they happen in response to each other. And when that doesn't match, I just, it doesn't ring true for me.
Yeah. That reminds me of, those old, like those Cossack sabers that were used, and they're kind of heavy. And wasn't it, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it the skinny longsword, the rapier?
Yeah.
French, yeah, probably Spanish. I think that one was invented to be quicker.
Right, and lighter.
Lighter and quicker. So when they looked at that sword and they laughed with their giant sabers, they thought that it was a joke, that it was flimsy, but it actually did a lot more damage because it was so light. You'd be able to just swing it and, get them faster.
It wasn't even just that it was faster in that respect. It was because it was lighter, it made you more mobile. You were more nimble.
Right.
You saw that with in the early wars, when the Scots were fighting the English, was because they weren't weighed down by all that armor in the bogs. They could move quicker.
They could move quicker.
That played effect in a lot of battles. I mean, there's a benefit to armor for sure, but being nimble has its own value. And anybody that's played any kind of RPG first-person shooter understands that, unless you're a tank or you're well armored, you have to be quick. Right. And if you are a tank, you better hope that your equipment is sturdy enough that it can outlast their speed, right? Because you only have to get lucky once, but they can move around a lot and tire you out in the meantime.
That's
So
right.
that's the other thing. Speaking of size, is everyone assumes the like for instance, armor was so heavy, and so I've seen some fantasy worlds where they write about like, oh, they're just weighed down by all this armor. They've done some tests, and I have some complaints against the way they conducted the test, but where they have people wear the full plate armor and they're running an obstacle course and they're beating like a soldier and a fireman and firefighting suit. Um, and it surprised me how nimble they could be in that equipment.
Right. Yeah.
I'll link the video to your listener if you want to watch it. My complaint was the firefighter was wearing equipment that he would run into a fire with, so I thought that was fair. The knight was wearing his armor and his sword. He left his shield and his baggage, but the soldier for some reason was wearing full ruck, and that's you wouldn't if you were assaulting something that would have been left behind. So for a comparison, they unnecessarily encumbered the soldier, but I mean that's nitpicking. Because it is his equipment, it just wouldn't be what you take to the field. But it's surprising how nimble that older equipment that we just assume, oh, it was so heavy they couldn't move. Which I think plays into it when you start talking about armor for either sci-fi or fantasy.
Yeah.
People go into it with those misconceptions, and then they write their fictional worlds based on the false premise of what they thought they know. And
turns out you can't be walking for miles every day on end carrying that heavy.
They actually, and it surprised me. They refer to, and I can't remember, it was one of the Confederate units during the Civil War, for instance, they called them the foot cavalry because they could march so fast and go so far that everyone just assumed that they were mounted, but they were just running.
They were running.
And then the other famous unit that could do that were the riflemen from the British Army and the Grenadiers. They were notoriously fast on their feet as well. So, you got to never underestimate, I guess, endurance.
Right. Yeah.
for ability. Now, when you're talking about fictional histories for planets and either aliens or non-existent, what do you think is the thing where you read and you say, this is absolutely a deal breaker for me? Like they clearly don't know what they're doing. Like, do you have a red line that you in the sand?
I'll let you take this one, Malachi, since you're a sci-fi planet.
I haven't really encountered many of those, maybe because I went to art high school and have the value of like all art is, has value in some way.
Okay.
So it's hard for me to be judgy about that. I'm like, okay, this author made some choices that I necessarily wouldn't have made.
Okay,
but I did enjoy a lot.
Are you running for Congress?
Really great reader.
Yeah, are you running for Congress? Because that's a very political answer. I appreciate you splitting hairs.
Very diplomatic.
So I think for me, when it comes to aliens, at least, I get you want it to be relatable to the audience who are humans that are reading it, but when you make everyone just a mirror image of humanity with no you go back to what Star Trek did back in the day with the forehead of the week, and everyone's basically the same with this one minor cosmetic. But when you're writing fiction, at least when you've got the words to do it, like make them different. Like they think differently, they talk differently. One of the things that I did separate from what Killian made her own language up and hired an actual linguist. I just cheated and used Babelfish, but I did what I call a language hop. So I started in English because that's what I speak, and I translated that English to, we'll say, German, and then from that German, I translated that directly to French, and then from the French, whatever. Like I just hopped languages, and depending on how foreign I wanted it to sound is how many languages, and then I ended up the end result translating that back to English, and you get that effect. Like if you remember Telephone as a kid,
right?
That game where you get that effect as long as you bookmark, so you use the same website every time. They have a cadence that's just different enough that it sounds alien, but it's still believable or still understandable. But you've got to make them sound and act like they're different because they are, right? They're aliens. They're mythical creatures or whatever.
No, that's really cool. That makes a lot of sense. I think that and you can do this with both fantasy and sci-fi when you're dealing with like creating a whole different race or a whole different planet or whatnot. And this is why I started with the language first, because when you're creating a culture, for me to make it easier as an anthropological perspective is what you have to decide on what, first of all, geologically your map looks like, And that will
Okay.
basically give you what resources do they have, how do they survive, and what are the common struggles, and decide on what kind of society you want to have. So for mine, for instance, the Apani were basically fishermen, and they were not fighters. They weren't warriors to begin with. They had like a defense, but they wouldn't even have armor because they were very spiritual. Like this whole like fifth dimension spiritual world like attached to them and through them, that they have like magic, and it's like elemental magic through this world. So they were very more spiritually connected. So from that, their language was really language, as in like what words they need, is like, fish, paddle, boat, water, or ocean, sea, those kind of things. And depending on like the region geologically, like the same kind of thing is like what they need. So it was interesting then to like write it and be like, okay, so now they had an invasion, and now it's this now present time where my character is there, to be like, how did that evolve from so many hundreds of years that they have had to fight, right? So it
Right.
was really interesting on like how the translation or the translation potion would like have them respond to the character, to the main character.
Okay. So for those that aren't cartographers, aren't map makers, do you think it's important to get the map made such that it makes sense geographically and geologically, or do you think just a general idea is good enough
It
to make
really
it believable?
depends. Yeah, it really depends on how in depth you want to go with the world. If you're doing epic fantasy, or if you're even doing like sci-fi, which in a way is very, it's very epic, then the more details you put into it, it's going to help you down the line, even if you don't bring all of that information in.
I think one of the things that I get the most is when people do include in their fantasy worlds their maps, and then for some reason their rivers don't flow like a river should. Like,
They're going
generally,
upstream.
right, or up a mountain instead of down, because
Down.
gravity apparently works backwards. And you can get away with a lot with magic, right? Like, and if you're on an alien planet, as long as you can give a hand wavium,
Mhm.
explanation, like
As
I
long
can,
as it can be explained.
but you have to know that you're doing something wrong so you can make a plausible explanation, right?
Mhm.
Instead of just doing it and then coming up with it after the fact. Um, I
Yeah.
actually tend to just roughly sketch the maps when I do it, and then so I don't know if you guys do it in archaeology, but as a grunt, as an infantryman, I don't know if they use infantrymen now that we have lady grunts. I'll have to check that out. So when I was in the infantry, we do this thing called sketch maps, and you'll do one called sector maps. Basically, the idea is you get an idea of your immediate surroundings, and then more like a straight line is a road. It doesn't have to be that detailed, right? But that's what a soldier would put in their notebooks with
Yeah.
little sketches. I keep it to that simple, and then if I need extra details, I can add it later. I've seen some people go full bore, like they do the Tolkien and they get the full world map, right? Like, do you have a preference when it comes to what the creatives use? Like, do you think it makes a difference?
I'm a little bit in between. I'm what you call a plantser. I plot and I pants. Um, and I do that even with my world building. Sometimes I try to give as much details as I possibly can before I start writing, so that I don't have any hiccups. But if I get stuck, I will just use what I have and then fill it in after. And I hate to say that, because at some point I will get stuck, and I will just start pantsing it, and then later on I look at the map that I drew and I'm like, shit. Now I have to go back and rearrange stuff because I'll forget something and it's not all completely clear. So I mean, I really prefer to have it all done before.
Okay.
This
So
doesn't always happen that way.
when you plan out your world, do you ever like print those maps so you can put little, I don't know, Lego here is the castle and this is the ruins, and or do you just keep it all in your head?
I did not print it out. I actually, to start, I used Incarnate, and after that then I hired like a map designer, map artist to make it a lot prettier, because I felt like Incarnate just looked very much like Incarnate, it was very
Yeah.
Incarnate-ish.
So I actually tend to, because I said I did my training both as hands-on. So in the history department, when we were studying things, look, especially when you're focusing on the military, the terrain matters so much to the tactics, to everything else. So we did a lot of sand tables as an undergrad historian studying military history, and then the Army uses that to plan as well for the same reason. So I find I use that, like I'll make an overall map, but then when I'm planning actual action, I'll like make a three-dimensional sort of terrain feature, so I can see, well, if I'm here, yeah, that X is over, to the north, but he might not see that because the trees are in the way, kind of thing. So I can be more, descriptive, because I think description is where you can sink or make your ship sail, right? Like you can ruin a story by getting stuff wrong, or you can get it right. There's a famous one, and I won't name names because we won't shame anyone. An author wrote a military sci-fi books in the space fleet genre, and one of his readers was a what do you call it? Naval architect. So he was curious, and he started mapping out the ship as he was describing it. And apparently, it never linked, and everything was open to space. And basically, they were all dead the minute they stepped on, because he didn't know where everything was. So he kept taking a lot of turns that ended up with a ship that was never, like, it was just a hodgepodge of like lines, like hallways that linked to nothing. Because which obviously is a bad thing, right? Like you want your stuff to be sound, right? You can do that on land too, like we talked about with rivers flowing upstream instead of down. And
it's definitely preferable to have it all drawn out. And also, obviously, like, for the love of the gods, close the spaceship. But
right.
but for epic fantasy, at least, like when you are on ground, you don't really need to be describing how far the river goes every inch of the scene. You know what I mean? Like, if you have a map, that's great. Get your characters to the river and know where they're going from there. That's where they're headed. And every once in a while, you can add in that description, the sounds of the water flowing, the birds, when you reach land, if you're on a ship in the ocean, things like that, to really like paint the scene. But you want, you want the readers to be immersed in what the characters are saying to each other, and the character emotions, or the fight scenes and things like that.
Okay. Well, we're going to pause for a moment because we're at the halfway mark to air this commercial, and we're going to shamelessly shill for the man, and then we'll come back and we'll let Malachi weigh in. But for now,
Alien Days is a multi-author anthology with thrilling tales of aliens, invasions, artificial intelligence, friendship, deceit, and extinction. This combination of stories makes it a must-read for science fiction short story fans. This anthology features Nebula and Dragon Award nominees, Amazon bestsellers and award winners, alongside rising stars in the science fiction genre. Let the authors take you on adventures through dystopian worlds and far-flung planets that will stretch your imagination. Welcome to Alien Days.
All right, thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude, dear listener. So, Malachi, we were talking about what makes it believable when it comes to like terrain, because that's where cultures exist in the environment where they were spawned, and so that clearly affects the lay of the land. How do you, like, you're a visually trained artist if you went to an art school. Do you tend to, when you're reading it, picture it as a painting in your head, as a movie? Are you able to just hit the I believe button?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's a combination of things. Sometimes when I'm reading, I'll see it as a movie. Often I'll be plotting out how to draw it as a comic.
Okay.
That's kind of how I got into all of this in the first place. I wanted to write and illustrate comics. But yeah, I definitely tend to I've also got trained in film production. So I definitely tend to like think of books as like, kind of without thinking about it, I tend to think of books as like screenplay, like the rules are.
It happens all the time. I do it too.
Usually the rules with a screenplay is that it's, a page per minute of film. And I'm always kind of like, whenever I read, you know, a new book, I'm always kind of like, I wonder how this could work visually rather than as this, you know, intense extrasensory experience that could contain a lot of different, you know, senses in it.
Okay, so when people add these fictional, like the histories to their world, do you think that that's something that they would you prefer if they go heavy-handed on it, like the history of this war led to this war, or do you like it when they string you along just a little bit enough to make the world feel lived in?
I like when it's heavy-handed because
Yeah, me too, but apparently some people don't like the info dump.
I definitely understand why someone wouldn't like it, but I grew up reading like Lord of the Rings with the appendices. And
You too.
yeah, and Dune and everything, and so I just want to know everything. Like like every other archaeologist, I would watch Indiana Jones movies as a kid, but I was just kind of like, okay, this guy likes to break stuff. I'm gonna go read about the second king. I'm going to go read about one of the Egyptian dynasties instead and learn about what, these cultures were actually like, because this is frankly a lot more interesting to me than the movie.
Yeah.
I was a really boring kid. I did research for fun, so that's just me.
Wait, that's not
I say
normal?
that's the opposite of boring. So I think that
people, yay!
I didn't know that was considered abnormal.
I think that it really also depends on the genre. I feel like some
Okay.
sci-fi or most sci-fi readers, I think they like all that real sci-fi stuff. They like all of the details, those mechanical details and stuff like that. And even epic fantasy, when you have like people who read like real epic fantasy, they want the world building, they want the conlang, and they can really like get nerdy into it. I think nowadays there are just so many subgenres, and we might get caught up on like a few really popular ones where they've kind of like, let's say, maybe Akatar and those kind of things where the world building is less and the focus is more between characters. And if you put too much world building, you'll get readers that are like, this is giving me a headache.
Yeah.
Even though it's a whole different world and it is technically epic fantasy, just the subgenre kind of became a little bit more niche.
So obviously, like the history of a culture affects like how it interacts now. So like for instance, the famous one is the events of World War II or World War One, and what we did after led to World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a knock-on effect that can cause further conflict or just further events. It doesn't always have to be war. So, but the other thing is not everything is known. So for instance, when some of the prehistoric, the sea peoples came in and they destroyed cultures, like we don't know a lot about them, right? So there's room for mystery. Do you like when they leave some mystery to the history of these planets and these fantasy cultures, or do you like it when the author says, nope, this is absolutely what happened and we're going to talk about it?
Is this for Malachi or
Either one of you?
Well, I will say that I think that once again I prefer like too much data over not enough. I really like lots and lots of detail and stuff you can sink your teeth into, at least as a reader.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, in case, because I get a little nerdy sometimes and I forget not everyone reads the same thing, as when Egypt was on the decline and the whole Eastern Med was sort of under attack during the late Bronze Age collapse. Don't ask me to give you years, because when I went to school, it was still BC and not BCE. So that just messes with my memory. But so it's basically a people that just showed up and started ransacking, and we really don't know where they were from and why they were doing it. Presumably, like all wars, it was resource oriented, but we just don't know. And so that was what I was referring to. But I notice a lot with the world building in fantasy and sci-fi, everything is known. You can get away with that more, I think, in sci-fi because modern technology allows you to record things. But the human memory is fallible, and sometimes we don't know why a culture we're interacting with is doing what they're doing. We just see the end result. So from my perspective, I love it when there's a little bit of mystery because the world and the characters in it just don't know.
Yeah. So I think that if that's done, if you are in a character's POV and they're let's say they're under attack, right? And maybe they weren't expecting it for whatever reason. They, that those particular characters, maybe politically around them, they knew something was going to happen. But when you get the point of view of someone being torn from their family, or the preparation of war, and you see you automatically, since you're reading that point of view, see the other side as the enemy, but we don't really know what's going on the other side. So that little bit of mystery, I like that, because it kind of leads you to think like, all right, there's more here, there's more to this world, and I want to find out what's going on. I think David Gemmell did this really in a cool way with his Nadir and Draenei Chronicles. Like, they're like two different series, but they're all in the same world, and they're basically fighting the same war, but you get both sides in those two different series.
Nice. That's a hard thing to pull off, though.
Yeah, I mean, those are old books, but it is very hard to pull off.
No, I just mean the yin and the yang. There's a modern version that did it with a bookend style. Richard Fox and Jonathan Brazi. Jonathan, I know so many Jonathans that are authors. I had to check which one. Jonathan Brazi wrote one. It was a mill sci-fi, and it was told from officers leading the small scale conflict, so like majors. So they were leading smaller forces, but both of them at opposite ends of the same battlefield were fighting each other. And so it's from both of their perspectives.
Right.
But I heard what research for them went into both ends of it, and how much like coordination, because even sometimes a one-liner can change everything, right? Like unintentionally so. And so, yeah, that's a very hard thing to pull off.
It's a lot to keep track of, and you're writing it in like, these are two different cultures, so we also need to see how they view each other and their reasons for hating each other, like their history and the different perspectives, because clearly they're both going to have different perspectives over the same thing that happened so long ago that they're now still fighting about,
So I grew up in Virginia, and so the Hatfields and McCoys of West Virginia aren't that far of a trip for me enough that came up in our history classes. So that's one of the things I that caught my attention with that incident in history, and that's sort of what you're describing is somehow along the way a fight started, whether one side was the bad guy or not. Both sides are going to claim it was the other guy. Mm-hmm. Sometimes two opposing forces just stumble into each other and misunderstandings happen and people die, and then chaos ensues. But it gets to be a certain point in time, nobody really knows. The lore is just what it is, and both sides fight because inertia. Like, because that's just what they've always done. We're at a war with the bad guys, and so we must fight them.
Yeah. A lot of times it stems from just survival.
Yeah.
And survival of the fittest. If you have two opposing forces that need a territory, or they, for whatever reason, whether it's resources or a place to live, that's going to be the fight. And instead of negotiating, or they try to negotiate, maybe one has an ulterior motive, and then that kind of like just causes conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys are both archaeologically trained, and I was just a generic historian. So I'll ask you this. There are sometimes in fantasy specifically where they will discover ruins. It happens in sci-fi, but not as much. But they'll discover ruins and they decide to investigate. You saw even in Tolkien, they found some dwarven ruins that they went through and encountered the baddies in. Do you like seeing that? And if you do, does it like make you cringe at all? Because like, ooh, you're destroying the history. Like, what are your thoughts on when you see archaeology portrayed in fiction?
I get excited.
I think it's fun. But I still keep in mind that good archaeology would make an incredibly boring movie.
Yeah.
Realize that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, in mine, because I had an ancient Greek invasion into this whole dimension that they were not expecting there to be a whole different like magical race, and their magic being like the huge opposition to this new Greek magic coming in.
Well, maybe I wanted to read your book.
I'm sorry.
Spoilers.
This is the backstory, guys. It doesn't really spoil much.
Thank God.
But so in The Fool's Journey, which is really technically book 0 of the Chronicles of Terrorland, the main character Harold is a bit of a nerd. He's not an archaeologist. He's interested in it. He's very nerdy compared to the actual main character of the rest of the series. So when he first lands in this new world, which is what we call Terrorland, but the natives call it Ipa, there are ancient Greek ruins, and he went through a portal to go to Jotunheim, which is a whole different Norse world. So when he ends up in this snow-covered wasteland and finds an ancient Greek column, he realizes that he made a big mistake. He made the wrong turn in his portal crossing dilemma. But the archaeologist in me really wanted him to be like, that is an ionic column. But I deleted it because it's like, you're going to overwhelm the readers. Like, especially this is already epic fantasy. There's already a whole like different magic system and conlang and all this other stuff. Let me leave out some of that technical, jargon.
So, Malachi, as sci-fi nerds, we have failed our readers, our audience so far, because we did not mention Stargate, the most iconic sci-fi property that involves archaeology. It just occurred to me when we've got like 15 minutes left of the show, and they're going to take our nerd card, so we've got to recover strong. So that's an actual example of involving those ancient.
Huge disappointment, but I haven't.
I know we will do better, people. We will do better. We'll like whip ourselves with hair shirts or whatever the ancient monks used to do. I didn't study that period of history, people. We're just going to hit I believe and move on.
Archaeology right now, and I promise it will never happen again. I will not let y'all down like this again.
But that's one example where you can incorporate ancient cultures in a way that's believable. Now, for Stargate, for those of you who don't know, what are you doing with your life? But the idea was these aliens, the ancient gods actually were aliens, and so they sort of abducted humans and took them to other places, and you could live out those periods. But it doesn't have to be actual like Earth-based societies where you can involve it. The plot of showing up on an abandoned world and finding things or remnants of culture could apply, with alien worlds, with, insert whatever. And that actually, can give you room to play with, anything you get wrong because, there's cultural drift or it's aliens. So you get a pass. Like that gives you a way for you who are amateur historians, but want to write about it or read about it to do so, I think, and still make it believable because you only have to get good enough. I mean, if Indiana Jones could do it, and that was questionable on some of the historiography, like you can do it.
I have to bring up though, if you're interested in more, sci-fi involving, ruins and archaeology, Prometheus is actually like one of the more accurate depictions of, professional archaeology or cultural resource management archaeology, which we call CRM. Just from an economic and like business perspective, obviously the field work is very different. We don't tend to use Geiger counters or get attacked by those types of things. But it's not the best movie ever made, but it is a movie involving archaeology that I think is really worth checking out if you're into that field at all.
It's a good one. I've seen it, but I do think there's ways to make it believable. And if you're going to go absurd, like, and you can't get it right, then just make it fun. Because the rule of cool will get you through a lot of obstacles of reality and realism if it's cool, right?
Yes. If it's stylized.
And whatever you do, for the love of God, midichlorians were a heresy, and don't go something that dumb. Like, just leave the magic. Like, let the force be the force. I'm not over that, Killian. I'm still bitter.
Me too.
Okay.
Sorry,
yeah.
you go.
So Star Wars. Yeah, it's a bit of a hybrid, isn't it?
Yeah, it's part fantasy, part sci-fi.
But you know what? I think it's why I love Star Wars, because I lean more into the fantasy, and that is just it. I understand the Force. I can understand it, but I feel like as long as they can explain it, which they do, it's okay.
Okay. All right. You were going to say Malachi. I'm curious. I'm all ears.
Oh,
Train left.
Chlorians were a travesty.
Yes. So here's something that came up. We did a fireside chat recently about realistic combat in fantasy and then realistic combat in sci-fi. And one of the overlying themes in both was that everything was too clean. Anyone that's ever been camping, anyone that's you're an archaeologist, you've lived in the field, you know, nothing ever stays clean. Like, so when you see these worlds where everyone is so clean and they're showered and their hair is perfectly groomed and their teeth are just perfect, I'm like, I'm not saying everyone's teeth was rotting out of their mouth like some bad Monty Python skit, but I mean, you know, they didn't have braces either.
Right.
Like, and so there's definitely a room for making things gritty and dirty and feel lived in.
Yeah.
Dirty Space was a very good development within sci-fi. I think I'm very much in favor of Dirty Space.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the official aesthetic name or just what I call it, or if I heard it somewhere. But
I've heard that before too. The kind of that grim dark realism.
yeah,
That's what they dinged the Stargate Universe franchise or sub franchise for, which I actually liked. It wasn't the same audience, so I get why. Well, then it went to Fox, where Fox Entertainment, where all good shows go to die. But there's definitely room for that kind of gritty realism. For me, like one of the lived in features with you're talking about cultures, military peoples have to account for everything. I don't care if it's fantasy, sci-fi, or modern day times. There's some supply sergeant somewhere who's going to make you sign for that in triplicate, maybe even in your own blood if it's fantasy. And so the idea that, you know, Bob died and I'm just leaving his crap there for the bad. No, you're grabbing it and taking it with you.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things the Stargate Universe series got right is, you know, when Bob died, they took his rifle and anything they could scrounge because resupply wasn't exactly coming tomorrow.
That is something that I keep an eye for.
Yeah. So the logistics, I guess, is what we're hinting at is, you know, considering the logistics. I think it was Napoleon that said famously, "A army moves on its belly," and I'm sure he was paraphrasing someone else. And that's the thing that a lot of you see it more in fantasy than anything because you can get like sci-fi gets the modern tech and the replicator type stuff as a way to get around logistical issues, 3D printing and whatnot. You could use magic, but most authors tend to make their magic more rare, I think, less ubiquitous. So in fantasy, like when the logistics are wrong, like I'm sorry, if you're in the middle of a desert, how did you get your water? I mean, you can in small. There's a reason desert peoples were smaller and nomadic, right? Or they were centered around a river. But you know, you're not just going to cross the desert with nothing either. So,
yeah.
Were there anything logistically that sticks out to you guys, given that you trained to do that in the field yourselves?
In both reading or on screen?
Either one.
Either one. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a little bit more forgiving just because now I'm paying attention to what the story needs a lot.
Right.
I know that in dystopian, I do watch a lot of dystopian stuff. I guess that's maybe my preferred form of sci-fi. And a lot of times it's like, yeah, it's like you need to now grab their resources, their knives, their guns, or whatever. A lot of time they're kind of just running from whatever, whether it's a zombie or some sort of mushroom fungus thing. Something I watched recently. It was good. I liked it.
So what gets me about that when you talk about the resources is, you know, gas isn't infinitely stable. It will break down over time. So if you're X number of years past the event,
something else. Yes.
The gas is done.
Right.
The cars still run. Where's the gas coming from? Who's still refining it? Canned goods, eventually they will expire. Most average canned goods. Now, there's prepper quality food. There's just not a lot of it. You'd have gone through it eventually.
And you
right, but
botulism.
Yeah, the canned goods generally are 2 to 5 years, depending on the cans. Of course, you can stretch that out if you're brave and you know what to watch for. 15 years, all of that's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. If you open one of those packages, what you're going to get is like gas.
Yeah.
You know, if it's meat,
there is a channel where there's a guy that goes around and he gets old MRE type meal field rations basically, and he will eat them. And he has eaten one from the 1890s. I don't know how he's not dead. Hashtag modern American medicine for the win, I guess. But like, you have to be so specialized to know what you're looking for to make that work. The average person is not, and then they haven't rationed their food. So like I said, 2 to 5 years, it's all gone.
MREs are infamous to constipate you too. So like, if you eat them that old, it's like, do you want diverticulitis? Because that's diverticulitis, you know.
So military MREs are 5-year shelf life. There are some civilian versions that will last longer. And I'm speaking of the American version because I haven't researched into what other countries are doing. But even with that shelf life, you could probably get a little bit past that if it's stored properly.
Right.
But most of the post-apoc, I've noticed it's about 20 years later, right? Because you don't have to show the actual cataclysm and make it believable. You can just sort of pick up in the ruins, which I get from a storytelling perspective. But that means you have to explain where all that food is coming from. And you could just not address it, and that's fine too. But if you have them doing a raid on an old building because, it's an abandoned grocery store, I'm looking at you, Fallout universe. Like, that food's all gone.
Oh, one show something that really stuck out to me recently was I was watching Sweet Tooth, and
I've seen that.
Yeah, so
it's a good show. It's cute.
It's great. Do you remember when that family up in that I guess it's like
the mountain retreat, the ski lodge?
Yeah. Okay, so the gondolas that were working,
are they electrically powered or would they be powered by a fuel generator? I honestly don't know.
I have no idea. They didn't show it, but like, who's working on that maintenance? Not the family. They just found that place.
Yeah. So if it's solar powered, the solar powers might last. If they're close enough to a nuclear power plant and it didn't go critical, that'll get you some years. But I mean, you have to know specifics of logistics. There's an interesting series that I think TLC did, but I could be wrong. It was called Life After People. And like, the premises is just, the rapture comes tomorrow and all people just disappeared all on the same day. Like, what happens to the earth? And it's definitely, like, I've heard critiques of some of the science behind it, but as a general rule for the layman, I thought it's perfectly acceptable. It's worth watching. They covered a lot of that, like the power and what would fail, and rubber gaskets are going to dry out. And that's.
I talk about Manhunt too much, but Manhunt does a really good job looking at the logistics of the apocalypse. Like, such a good job, so much detail, like thinking about like how to find gasoline, what people are eating, the like city states that have sprung up in the ruins of America, trade routes. It's magnificent.
And how many people kill themselves for gas when the apocalypse is just coming out?
Yeah. That's an interesting one too. One of the things that people also forget, because modern conveniences have allowed us to build wherever. Like, let's just face it, Las Vegas, Arizona, those probably wouldn't look like they did today if we didn't have modern infrastructure. Nope. We were building on rivers for a reason. We were building near bodies of water. Yeah, exactly. And I think we would go back to some of that. If you like documentaries about this kind of stuff, they are not a sponsor, but Curiosity Stream, it's like Netflix for nerds. It's all documentaries. I love it. There's a few competitors for them that have popped up. I can't remember the name of it. A lot of the people that were doing documentary type shows in that genre on YouTube went there because they could get paid, because just the way the ads worked. And so there's a few options, but there's a lot of good documentaries out there on this that looks into this stuff with some really smart people that you wouldn't have otherwise heard of.
Excellent.
Cool.
So
excellent. Yeah, in archaeology, usually when we, if we do a survey of an area and there's a waterway, that's a high probability area. Because it's a source of food, but it's also a source of getting to trade routes.
Yep. Yeah. And sometimes freshwater.
And freshwater springs.
Before they dredged the river in downtown Miami, there were river rapids, and there were also freshwater springs that would come up, Yeah,
we have those all around Miami.
Yep. Not anymore. You wouldn't know looking at the modern landscape, but that was the case.
Yeah.
That's actually, so I'm working on a series with James Ward. It's modern Striker Brigade gets sucked into fantasy Egypt. And that's one of the things that I'm surprised that you don't think about when it comes to geography is rivers actually move too. Like you're talking about what humans did when we essentially, I don't want to say terraforming, but like when we cultivated land to make it more what we wanted it to be. So, you intentionally move rivers, or, you solidify bogs so you can use it. Like there's a lot of things we can do to change terrain. That you don't realize that even without that, rivers just shift, generally speaking, sometimes.
Yeah.
Because the Nile isn't where it is today, or it wasn't back then, in Nefertiti's time, for instance. Like it's moved.
Yeah.
By how much, that's going to depend on where you're at, but that's an interesting thing to factor in. I will say, we talked about food running out. There are places and situations where it could last indefinitely. I'm thinking they've discovered some of the ships that sank in the Black Sea, and they've gotten deep enough that they're below the salination level, and they're actually pulling those amphoras. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Amphora,
the teardrop-shaped clay pots, and they're pulling those out intact, and they're opening them, and they're finding that the food that's in it is still consumable if you're brave enough and you don't want to bring a modern plague, because we don't know that our stomachs could handle some of the germs and stuff. And if you want to see what that could look like as a worst case scenario, House did an episode, the doctor show, where a diver found one of those, and he ended up getting I want to say smallpox or something like that from a wreck, from a naval ship.
That'll happen. And I have destroyed my digestive tract far enough on our archaeological sites to ever do anything like that.
Yeah, there's unfortunately a convention in archaeology and geology where sometimes you lick a rock or a bone to identify what it is. We're really trying to get folks to stop putting things they found in the ground in their mouth.
Just stop. If it sticks to your tongue, it's a bone. If it doesn't, it's pottery.
And I'm like, it has a porous membrane.
Don't ask me how I know that.
It has a porous membrane. The other stuff doesn't.
Don't do it.
You figure it out in other ways.
Wasn't it Meryl, Mal, that gave us the story? And Meryl was going to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. Because her father's a paleontologist.
Okay.
So he told us that they found a woolly mammoth in ice.
In Siberia, yes.
And I'm not sure where it was exactly. And I wish he was here to tell us the story, but Malachi already knows what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
They defrosted it and they cooked it.
That they did. I
really
wish I was here.
What did it taste like? What did it taste like?
I'd imagine steak, but I don't know.
So there has been an instance where with the changing temperatures, and we don't need to get in the climate debate because there's lots of valid arguments on all sides that I think are worth considering, but not today. But one of the things that has happened as the permafrost shifts, because it's in places it wasn't before and not in other places, and we've discovered things like the bog man has come up. We've got the famous guy that was they found him. He's the oldest murder victim we found. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but Curiosity Stream had a documentary on him. But they're not a sponsor. I should reach out. But one of the things that you find is that some of the stuff, like the viruses and amoebas and whatnot, that have been frozen for all these, they come back to life. And I'm like, do you want zombies? Because that's how you get zombies.
Exactly. And they basically they have a hibernation period of almost eternity.
Which, I mean, I remember reading about that because it came out right as COVID was hitting.
At least. Yeah,
it came out right as the discovery of this came out right as COVID was hitting. So we were all a lot more sensitive to it. And I just remember all the memes like, do you want the zombies? Because this is how you get the zombies. So we are at the hour mark, and we record at 9, which means it's now 10 o'clock for these people, and they have day jobs they have to get up for. So I don't want to go forever. If you have topics in the field of making histories in fictional worlds believable that you want us to address, we could certainly have them back for another episode. So be sure to comment on the Facebook where you find it, or anywhere else you find it. Reach out to us directly, and we'd certainly like to expand on the topic if you're interested. But with that said, as we wrap these fireside chats up, we like to say, so what is everyone reading? So what are you guys reading right now?
I am reading The Iron King by Julia Kagawa.
Okay. Do you like it?
So I usually go for upper YA or new adult, as is my writing. So this is definitely more on the younger YA. I'm still enjoying it, for sure. But yeah, it's definitely sweet. It's a lot sweeter than I'm accustomed to.
They have counseling for that. Just saying.
Yeah.
So what about you, Malachi? What are you reading?
I am reading Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg because I am, in fact, a walking stereotype.
There is nothing wrong with that. So I need to. I just finished A Spring for Spears by Katie Cross and Derek Sidaway, and I just wrote the review for that because I write reviews for Upstream Reviews. And so I needed a palate cleanser before I dive into another book. So I'm actually reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations again. I read that every so often. I like his stoicism sort of takes on things. It seems to be ageless, which surprises me because while I think humans are still humans because a lot of our emotions are chemically based and that hasn't changed that we know of. I do think the cultures we exist in affects us too. That old nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
So it surprises me every time you see things that are, he wouldn't be that out of place for the modern infantry today. And he wrote from the Roman perspective 2,000 years ago or more. I don't have a calculator handy, people. Don't ask me to do math. So that's what I'm reading.
None of us can do math here.
Yeah, I studied history because I didn't have to do the math. So, it's just one of those things. I do find it fascinating. Did you guys as archaeologists have to take the historiography class, the history of history?
I took the science version of that.
Okay.
But not
Yeah.
I learned a lot about the history of science and the history of anthropology and
That's right. Yeah.
all kinds of different ontologies. But never just because I wasn't a history major. Yeah.
One of the reasons that reminded me is because we didn't talk about this, but the other thing is when you talk about archaeology is the rule for the room for past mistakes to compound the knowledge of the peoples. So like some of the dinosaurs that we think were dinosaurs were actually composites. And I imagine because creatures that are living are fallible, unless they're gods, that's going to happen on your alien worlds too. So just food for thought as we wrap this up. Killian, what are you writing right now? Because you are a resident author.
I just finished editing or getting my edits finalized to give to my copy editor of book 2 of Chronicles in Terrorland. So that is finally done. And
Nice.
Yeah, I'm going to give myself a week and then outline book 3 and start on that.
Nice. So Malachi, I understand you have certain art credentials and you like to do that as a hobby. So what are you working on? Do you have any projects you can talk about?
Well, currently for my full-time job with Florida Public Archaeology Network, I'm working on the illustrations for an AR app that we are building with the Jupiter Lighthouse Outstanding Natural Area. The lighting.
Here, let me give you full screen real quick. So,
but just like some historical reconstruction of canoe building, tool making, cooking stuff, the types of things that people that Haga people living in the town of Hobay might have been getting up to, around 3,000 years ago, I think was our cutoff point for what we were going to talk about in the app. Cool. As well as a painting, a personal product of mine, a painting of what I describe as the toilet garden in one of the houses, one of the many houses I've been kicked out of. Living in Miami under a housing crisis. So
look at that! It's a toilet. How Hemingway of you.
I had my previous landlords have been very strange people, and one of them ran a permaculture farm that he was a general contractor, so we just had a bunch of random construction stuff lying around, including a garden of toilets out in the forest, and I just thought it was so becoming. So I took a bunch of pictures of it, and now I'm painting it.
I like it. Weird people are my people.
Yeah. Hemingway had a urinal in his backyard, in his garden. It's a cat fountain, so
she's entirely too sober to be too Hemingway. So that's progress. So I'm still working on the second book of the Curse Brigade series, which is that the modern striker brigade going into fantasy Egypt. Life has been weird, so I've been writing slower than normal, but I'm picking up speed again. And we lost a little bit of momentum because the publisher brought on more editors. So they said, instead of sending it to us when you're done with book 3, send us book 1 now and we'll get it done, which meant we had to stop. And I don't know if anybody who isn't a writer, like, your editing brain is different than your writing brain.
Yeah.
So it's like you got to halt the train, and it takes a little bit of time to slow it down, and then you got to go the other direction to do the editing. And we just finished the first draft of that full edit, and I'll be getting it ready hopefully within the next week or 2 to send to the publisher. And in the meantime, I'll be writing like split shift, essentially half day editing, half day writing, trying to push the story forward. And book 2 is at like 40,000 words right now with a goal of 120. So I guess we're about a third of the way there as we record this in the end of May.
Excellent.
So.
That's great. And editing and writing at the same time is
Oh,
not easy.
goodness.
I don't recommend it. I get the benefit of, I work with family that help with the editing. So like they're sort of directing the project and just pointing me in the right direction. Like, okay, we need to look at this one section. Don't read anything else. This one section. And so it keeps me sort of focused in the small details. But I'm not just editing a novel. I've got a novella and a short story that I'm also editing at the same time that all got their notes back from the editor at the same time. So I think in the future, one at a time projects probably is going to be best for my sanity and what little hair I have left. So, all right, as we wrap this puppy up, Malachi, thank you for coming. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
And you too, Killian. So, Malachi, if they wanted to reach out to you about the art that you do, where could they find you? And we'll link it in the show notes.
If you want to talk about scientific illustration, you can find me at JPEG Artifact on Instagram, which is jpeg.artifact. And if you want to talk about archaeology, the Florida Public Archaeology Network, I'm in the Southeast region. Our website is fpan.us. You can navigate to our contact information in the Southeast region page, or you can find us on Facebook and Instagram as FPAN Southeast. And we do free talks for schools and museums and historical societies and anyone who will let us flap our gums about archaeology.
Okay, that is interesting. And so if you run a con in Florida and you want them to come talk about history, because that could be pertinent for certain fantasy worlds, they would love to get nerdy with you. So reach out.
Yes, we would. Thank you.
So how can they reach you, Killian? And I'll link all of this as usual in the show notes.
Sure. So for me, it's pretty easy. You can go to, if you're using Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatnot, it's always at Killian_Wolf_author. And you can find me there. My website's also KillianWolf.com. And my email is Killian@KillianWolf.com.
All right. Well, thank you for that. You can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We do answer those, I promise you. We have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen, and you can comment about our various episodes when we post them at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. You can follow us on our website at anchor.fm/Blasters and Blades. Again, anchor.fm/Blasters-and-Blades, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on, and it is greatly appreciated. These podcasts aren't free to produce. There is some overhead, and we appreciate every bit you guys do to defray that cost. And if you don't have the money to do that, share it with a friend, get the word out. That helps too. Or you can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly caffeinated. They will drink until their liver explodes, people, because coffee is important. We really should get a coffee sponsor too. Maybe then it gets me free coffee. That's the real reason I want that. I'm not going to lie. And if you like the YouTubes, if that's your preferred consumption method for content, I will say I have enjoyed some of Killian's content. I link her YouTube channel. It is worth watching. She is very animated, and I don't know why she's not narrating her own dang books, because she's got talent.
That's an idea.
And enthusiasm. So that counts a lot. But Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the absentee Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.